So usually when a deck becomes pooped, so that means when a deck is old, it's clumpy, it doesn't fan evenly, and the edges are brown. Usually when a deck becomes pooped, people actually sort of recommend different sort of remedies for sort of solving this issue. And one of those remedies is actually something known as fanning powder. Now, is fanning powder actually what people make it out to be? It's sort of a interesting product, and I would like to actually sort of discuss it in detail. So fanning powder at its core is actually a sort of chemical known as zinc stearate. So zinc stearate is actually known for its hydrophobic properties. So hydrophobic means that it just repels water, and it's actually known to be non-stick as well. So in everyday use outside of cards and all that stuff, you'll see actually zinc stearate be used to sort of lubricate machines, and you'll even see sort of powder makeups in particular, sort of use a zinc stearate to bind together all the different sort of ingredients and stuff like that. But magicians and cardists actually use zinc stearate, or fanning powder in this case, to really just allow their cards and their fans to actually be distributed evenly throughout the fan and spreads and all of that stuff. But does it actually, quote unquote, revive a deck like people actually claim it does? So if you actually haven't used fanning powder before, it's kind of tough to describe it because it does affect a deck differently depending on its finish, depending on its stock and all of that stuff. I would say that ultimately fanning powder does add a sort of waxiness to the cards. I mean, you are basically applying like a thin sort of layer of powder on the cards, so it's sort of interesting. So you'll notice that after applying fanning powder to your cards, the cards will actually feel different, and fans and spreads and all the whole 9 yards will actually be a lot more even. They'll actually clump together less. All the cards are actually a lot more evenly spaced out, versus if you had like an older deck, they tend to actually just have giant clumps in them, for example, right? So in a way, right, the cards after applying fanning powder do sort of stick together in a very particular way, so that they sort of pull against each other, and then that sort of pull, that sort of stickiness or tackness, I guess, I don't know. I don't really know how to describe it. Again, it's really hard to describe it. This sort of tackiness to it is what allows these cards to sort of fan evenly against one another, if that sort of makes sense, right? And because of that sort of feeling, because of that sort of thin sort of layer of powder, that will actually affect sort of how your cards feel, and by extension, how you sort of do your slides and how you actually just, you know, handle the cards. Because like I said, there is inherently a sort of stickiness to it. So if you're, for example, if you're used to doing like an Urdnase change with a non-powdered deck versus doing it with a powdered deck, the experience will be drastically different. And so people don't actually talk about how that actually affects different slides. But you know, you know, it's called fanning powder for a reason. It's deliberately made for spreading and fanning cards, right? For card manipulation, where you do need to display all of these cards. So no, it won't miraculously, wow, I can't speak. It won't miraculously sort of revive your decks, and it won't unding a corner, it won't like increase your cards, but it will sort of solve the clumpiness of cards. So your spreads, your fans, and all of that stuff will be better. But do note again that they do affect how you handle sort of different slides, like a double lift. If you do like a push-off double, that will be affected and all of that stuff. And also another thing to note about fanning powder is that there's actually a possibility, if you apply fanning powder unevenly, that there's actually, you know, stains that form on the backs of the cards. So using like a black back design, you might notice that there's like smudges here and there. So that is something that you do want to take note of. So yeah, fanning powder ultimately is best used for fans and spreads and all of that stuff. It won't revive your deck, it won't make your slides better, it'll actually affect how your slides are sort of performed and all that stuff. So you might want to test out, you know, just a couple of decks with fanning powder before you actually use them for any sort of sleight of hand. So really, again, it's fanning powder. It's dedicated for fans, for spreads, and all of that stuff. So do make sure that if you ever do apply fanning powder, make sure to test it out with a sort of old deck, sort of a deck that you don't really care about. See if you actually like it, and then, you know, consider using it for other decks. Of course, I do have to give a brief history lesson, so it's kind of hard to find references for fanning powder in sort of Magic literature, because, well, you wouldn't necessarily find references in books for fanning powder. Instead, what you'll see is that you'll probably find them in sort of ads, right? Where the instructions, all that stuff will be included in said ads because, well, it's a product that people sell, right? It's not like knowledge where you just can just publish them in books, right? This is a physical product, and I think this, actually no, this doesn't even have like instructions. But yes, there is actually a QR code that tells you where to actually get instructions on how to apply fanning powder. So again, it's hard to find references for fanning powder in history because, well, they come in ads, they come in like, it's a product on its own, so that's why you won't see it sort of floating around. The oldest reference I could actually find for fanning powder was actually in the Jinx issue 17 back in 1936, where Ben Badley actually gave tips on how to sort of apply it and how to use it. And then in another sort of Magic publication, Goldston's Magical Quarterly, volume 4 back in 1938, there was actually an ad, and I quote, "Fanning powder $6 per box, postage $2, the short road to expert card fanning. Herbert J. Collins, with the aid of this remarkable powder, is now using his old packs," unquote. And the oldest known sort of product for fanning powder, at least that I could find, was actually the Fan Easy powder, which I've actually seen associated with Audley Walsh. We've recently spoken about him in the Vernon Strip-Out edition. So that's pretty much the oldest reference for fanning powder product I could find. But you know, there's chances that it's probably a lot older than that. I mean, you know, card manipulation is old, and it makes sense that people would try and find ways to spread their cards a bit more evenly. But yeah, that's pretty much all the ads that I've seen for fanning powder in the older times. Now, do note that a lot of these older ads just claim that it allows you to spread cards better. That's because cards back then were, well, unrefined. The finish was really bad, so they had to add additional substances to make decks sort of fan better. Nowadays, it's not really that necessary. Nowadays, I mean, we sort of shifted this angle to sort of reviving decks because, well, nowadays it takes cards a lot longer to just start clumping up. Beforehand, back in the older times, decks would just be clumpy because they're old, they're gross, they're unrefined. But nowadays, cards fan right out of the box. There's really not like a reason to apply fanning powder on cards anymore because they're just that much more well printed nowadays. Which is why nowadays you see them sort of catered to reviving decks, because clumpy decks are old decks, and then, you know, old decks, you want to use them for longer, so then you apply fanning powder, so then you can continue fanning and spreading them evenly. So yes, it was a sort of later add-on to fanning powder, this connotation of it reviving decks. And then of course, it was later adopted by the cardistry community, and it was especially made famous by one particular cardist or XCM guy, and that was Predator, who has some of the most amazing sort of mind-bending fans and spreads out there. Of course, I did skip some general history behind fanning powder, but that's the general outline. Nowadays, fanning powder, like I said, is, you know, it's rarely used because of just the quality of the cards, but you can still sort of find it quite easily. Murphy's Magic puts out, you know, the fanning powder, and then other Magic stores will have them. And even Square Up Cards, which is a cardistry brand, has their own sort of fanning powder product. Now, just before we get into applying fanning powder onto your decks, So just a couple of warnings, zinc stearate is a non-toxic product, but is still, with that said, a very, very fine white powder. Now, I know, it sucks that I do have to give this warning, but the first instinct for a lot of people who are less mature is to actually snort it. Now, I know that you would laugh at that. You would laugh at, oh, who would ever snort something like this? I've been an air cadet before, and I've seen cadets snort the vanilla powder of an MRE. You cannot underestimate people. So, with all that said, I do have to give a warning to not snort random white fine powders, including this. Even though it is technically non-toxic, it's still a fine white powder, and if it gets into your respiratory system, it will still irritate your sort of respiratory systems, and preferably, I would rather that not happen. So yes, do not snort fanning powder. So yes, because again, this is a very fine white powder, preferably you should use it in a sort of well-ventilated area, because again, if you just, accidentally inhale some in, then, you might have some irritation in your respiratory system. And then two, it might also be a fire hazard because, if it floats up in the air and there's a fire or anything like that, you can have like a dust explosion or stuff like that. So this is just general warnings for any type of powder, not even just for fanning powder, but preferably use it in a well-ventilated area. And that applies for any sort of powder product out there, right? Not just for fanning powder, but I still have to, in good conscience, give out these warnings. And for basically less hazardous warnings, this is still a powder, so expect it to go sort of places. You can wash it off. It's, it's not too bad. It doesn't stain anything. So you can wipe it off and all that stuff. But preferably, have a nice surface where you can sort of just clean it off. Have like a mat or anything like that, or a trash bag, or just apply it like over like the trash can or whatever, right? Just be in an environment where you can just clean up easily after yourself. And preferably, wear old, nasty work clothes, which I am not, so that's a bad thing. But yeah, preferably wear like a older set of clothes. So those are all things that you should sort of consider before you apply any sort of fanning powder. So again, these aren't just warnings for fanning powder, but for any sort of powder substance in general, right? Fanning powder, again, is non-toxic. It's zinc stearate, but again, for any sort of powder substance, there should still be some measure of caution that should be applied. Okay, so I set up my mat, which is just brown paper that I got from an Amazon package. So there's actually a lot of ways to actually apply fanning powder. One particular method is that you just toss the cards into a bag full of fanning powder, you shake it a whole bunch, and then you just take out the cards, reassemble everything, and then you would have applied fanning powder sort of somewhat equally. So that's the method that Predator actually uses. The other method is from Jaspis, who actually does a flower fan from an inflated deck. So he does this, and then he applies the fanning powder throughout this sort of flower fan over here, right? So he just does it from the top, and that would be it. I don't like really either of those methods because I find that actually distributes the fanning powder fairly unevenly. I personally use the Lotus in hand method, which I think requires less fanning powder and distributes everything a bit more evenly. So, generally for fanning powder, there's just 3 settings, right? There's this one, which is just tiny little holes. There's with this one, which is just a sort of pouring slit thing. And then there's this one, which is just, alright, just Hail Mary and pour everything all at once. I never use this option, nor this one. I actually use this option over here, which is just the ones with the tiny little holes, because I think, again, this distributes everything the best. So, to get started with fanning powder, all you really need to do is to take your old deck and then fan it out, and then hope that everything somewhat fans evenly. So you can do a thumb fan, or you can even do a side pressure fan, so one of these things, which I don't do well, so yeah. We can do one of these as well. If your fan is actually clumpy when you do this, you can take your other hand and you can just spread the cards out a bit. You want at least just a bit of the backs of the cards sort of exposed, every one of them, right? So once you have that, what you're gonna do is that you're just gonna take your can of fanning powder, and then you're just basically just gonna gently just apply a bit. So what I just do is that I tilt the can, and then I use my right index to just basically just give it a couple of taps, and you'll see that it comes out just like so, alright? So you want to just give it a nice tap, and then just let everything fall, alright? So do notice that I'm doing this from a distance. The reason why I'm doing this from a distance is because if I actually do it from a smaller distance, right, everything just goes in a clump. But if I do it from a higher up, from a higher distance, it distributes things a bit more evenly, which is why I'm tapping it sort of at a sort of larger height, right? So you don't need too much. So just make sure that every sort of card has just a bit, like so, right? Once you have this, what you can do is that you can just take your right index, just smear the fanning powder sort of across the long edges of each card, making sure that sort of every card has just a bit on the long edge and a bit on the backs, all right? Just do this, just pat everything down like so. And then that will be good. So it doesn't have to be fully sort of pressed into the fan, right? It can just be sort of smeared, and you can have some clumps, that's fine. Because what you'll do after is that you'll actually close the fan. You'll notice that one edge has all of the fanning powder, one edge doesn't. So in this case, what you can do is that you can actually split the deck, just like so. You can split the deck, reverse one packet, and then faro everything together, just like so, right? Just faro everything together, push everything in, and just smear this long edge again, just like so, right? Just rub everything smooth until it disappears into the long edges. And you'll repeat this just once or twice. So that's one. Just faro everything together. Or alternatively, what you can do is that you can also, once you've farrowed everything in, just rotate one packet counterclockwise or clockwise, doesn't really matter, as long as one packet is rotated. So then you can just sort of press the long edges sort of through each packet, which distributes the fanning powder into one another, right? And you just do the same thing, just rub the edges, smooth it out, do the same thing, faro, just like so, and then just rotate, and there we go, right? After that, you actually just do an overhand shuffle. So what you do is that you just take one card, peel, take one card, peel, and you basically repeat this a couple of times for every single card. Right, just do this a couple of times. And this just ensures that all of the cards actually just have sort of fanning powder evenly distributed through them, all right? Do a couple of swing cuts just to make sure that the backs and the top card alternate, and then repeat. So you want to apply enough pressure onto the cards as you actually overhand shuffle them, just to make sure that you smear the cards sort of against the faces against the backs, just so then you're applying the fanning powder somewhat evenly, right? And then, you know, just one last time. There we go. And then give the deck just a fan, just a test fan. You'll notice that it is a lot more even, right? In terms of just fanning, in terms of spreading. You will get, again, some fanning powder in your hands, but that's fine, right? So one thing that I do want you to sort of notice is that I actually didn't put a lot of fanning powder on these cards, because it's actually a lot better if you put in smaller quantities first, because you can always just add more later on. But you can't take away too much fanning powder. If you sort of apply too much fanning powder, then that's going to be an issue, because then you just have all of these gross powdery cards, and you don't want that. Which is why I start off with a smaller amount of just fanning powder on these cards, and then if I need any more, that's when I actually just repeat the process, tap it out, and then I can just, you know, adjust accordingly, right? So always start with not enough and then add more later on. But yeah, you can see that these cards now fan a lot better. This was actually one of my first custom decks. I know, very edgy. I think every sort of beginner magician slash cardist goes through this phase, but you can see that now the cards actually sort of fan and spread a lot more evenly. So that is something that you can do. This is applying fanning powder. It's relatively easy, it doesn't take too much time, and yeah, that is our tutorial for applying fanning powder. So there's actually been sort of attempts at sort of finding alternatives for fanning powder. So there's a couple. So there's cornstarch, but cornstarch is interesting because unlike zinc stearate, which is what fanning powder is made from, cornstarch also absorbs water. So humidity will impact the cards more heavily versus zinc stearate, which is again hydrophobic. So if you do apply fanning powder to cards, it won't, you know, it'll tend to handle humidity better versus if you actually use cornstarch. Another alternative is actually baby powder, which is also just cornstarch, I've heard, from what I've seen. But I've also seen it being made of something called talcum powder, but I'm actually not too sure about that. So baby powder and cornstarch is something that I've seen. But there's also a third alternative, and that is actually wax. This is actually just a dollar store candle, but wax is something that I've seen, and apparently it's popular with people in Asia as well. So this is just a dollar store candle that I've seen, and that is actually a method that I actually tried out pretty much before fanning powder. I've actually tried out fanning wax, or just wax in general, before fanning powder, because I mean, wax is a bit more accessible than zinc stearate and fanning powder. So that's something that you can also use. So wax, like I said, wax is an alternative to fanning powder that I tried before because wax is more accessible versus something like this, which is a dedicated product, and wax is just a candle. It's just a dollar store candle, right? Bon Lee did actually put out a fanning wax. So it's basically just a giant block of wax. But when I actually first started, I used a dollar store candle, and it actually worked fine. So I'll keep using a dollar store candle, and I'm going to be testing it against probably one of the worst handling decks I think that everyone knows about, and that is the Royal Tragedy cards by Bicycle. Oh my god. This actually surprised me because it's spreading clumps. Look at this. Oh man. Oh, okay, that's not good. Okay, the perfect testing conditions. I didn't realize that they would still be this clumpy because I let them rest. I let them rest for so long, but oh wow, okay. Okay, so they're not great. But yes, so okay, going back to this. Sorry, I got sidetracked. But going back to the wax, there's actually different types of wax, like there's food wax, there's beeswax, and there's other types of wax that you might be able to test out for your cards. So I'm using a dollar store candle because that's what's accessible, but if you have access to sort of different types of wax, I am sort of curious to see how it interacts with cards, but I've always just used dollar store candle wax. But there's 3 things that you do have to keep in mind when you're applying wax to cards. So 1, this will be more time consuming than fanning powder because you need to treat each card individually. 2, since you are applying a thin layer of wax on top of your cards rather than just powder, this will basically just add a slight thickness to the cards. I do have an aviator where I actually applied wax to it, and it got quite a bit thicker. 3, it's still wax, and it can collect basically a whole bunch of stuff like dirt and stuff like that, so there might be dark spots on your cards after you apply wax. So yeah, it might not be for everyone. I mean, it's wax, so you will feel wax on the cards. It's weird, but I think it's just interesting for everyone to try it once, especially if you have extra poop decks and just extra cards to try it out on, which is what I'm really doing with this. But anyways, it's really simple to apply wax on your cards. It's just kind of time consuming. So really just have your mat set up. What you're going to do is you're just going to place the card sort of horizontally. Take your piece of wax and just brush over the cards up and down like so, just very lightly. Do it like so, right? Just pin it against the mat. Next, you're just going to rotate it, and you're just going to apply it sort of on a widthwise, I guess. Just do this up and down once more. All right. Switch hands, and once you're done with the backs, you're going to do the exact same thing with the faces. So you just turn this card upside down, take your piece of wax and apply it up and down once more, just like so. All right, just again very lightly against these cards. Okay, turn it the other way around and then apply it up and down once again. All right. And there we go. We have our very first treated card. You can just take your hand and just brush off the excess wax like so. But this is our first card, and you can see that it is, yeah, you can see all the wax, all the wax brushes on top of it. But yeah, you just basically have to repeat this 51 more times, assuming that you're not using jokers. So yeah, I'll just fast forward it and you can see the final result at the end. Okay, so that took me about like what, 28 minutes. So after that, you can just sort of give the deck just an overhand shuffle the same way. Just press down, peel off one card, and then just repeat, just to make sure that everything is sort of evenly distributed in the deck, right? Let's do that. There we go. Now I do have to give a warning that this deck is notorious for not being able to fan properly, even with fanning powder. I think the only person who's made these sort of fan was actually Predator. Predator using his method, which means that he had to pretty much, I mean, just soak these in fanning powder for these to actually be able to fan. So these cards are notorious for their horrible handling. They're probably good for packet cuts, but they don't look that good anyways. So yeah, let's give these a fan after we're done treating all of these cards, right? So they are just a slight bit thicker than usual because of the wax, but if we give these a fan now, I mean, they still fan pretty terribly. You can still have better fanning cards, but honestly, for a Royal Tragedy deck that was, I mean, clumping before I even did anything with these, like, this is not bad. This is acceptable. I know it's an underwhelming result, right? Especially the amount of work that I put in, but if you're doing this on your own, you can actually notice which cards are actually sort of undertreated, because they actually stick out a bit more. So yeah, then you can just easily pick out which ones need to be sort of treated more, take them out, and just do the same process over those cards, right? I actually have a deck that I actually waxed before. These are the aviators that I was talking about. And so yeah, I mean, they do seem a bit clumpy, but yeah, if you actually take a listen, you can literally hear the cards sort of sticking together because of the wax. But if you actually give these a fan, sorry, let me just make sure that they're not clumpy anymore. If you actually give these cards a fan, they actually fan really well, right? So if you actually wax these cards properly, I don't know if that even makes sense. If you actually just apply a layer of wax on these cards properly, they actually fan really nicely. Like, look at this look at this nice even fan from these aviators. Again, they are a bit thicker than usual, but yeah. So if you actually just use a proper deck, just don't use these ones. The Royal Tragedy deck is absolutely horrible for doing anything. So if you actually just use like a normal deck like an aviator, and just like the normal wax or whatever, and just apply the wax, you will get pretty even fans. So that is just something that you do have to take into consideration. I was just curious if wax could save these, but I guess not even wax can save these. So yeah, these are beyond saving. But if you do use wax for normal decks, it will work. It will give you a nice even fan, right? Even though, again, they will feel waxy, they will feel sort of sticky, but that is something that you can do if you don't want to apply fanning powder and get it sort of everywhere, all right? So that's just a video on fanning powder and wax. It's a bit longer than other videos on the same subject. So if you actually look on YouTube, there's so many videos on fanning powder and how to apply it and all that stuff. But I do hope that this video does contain, a bit more information regarding just fanning powder by itself and not just how to apply it and stuff like that. But honestly, with the way that decks are printed nowadays, like I mentioned in sort of the history section, all that stuff, it's really not necessary to actually apply fanning powder anymore, right? It's just that, if you have a clumpy deck that you've used up for months and maybe years even, right? It's, it could be an interesting alternative if you just want to start having a deck that sort of fans and, spreads evenly again. But nowadays you can just, use up a deck, let it rest off to the side, come back to it like a while later, and then it'll be, better, right? So nowadays fanning powder isn't really that necessary, but I do think it is sort of interesting to sort of just try it out, right? It's, it changes the feeling of your cards, it changes how they spread, how they fan, how they handle. So I do think that, if anything, it is still an interesting thing to sort of work with. It's still, if you have the opportunity to try it out, why not? But again, it will sort of permanently change how cards feel. So do make sure that if you do have an opportunity to use it on an older deck or a deck that you just kind of don't really care about, and just test out how they feel. And so yeah, that was our video on fanning powder and wax. Stay healthy, stay safe, and see you guys next time.